compact that it gets the job done. And it does really good things sometimes too, where your opponent has a cheap commander and they're planning on chain casting it twice in one turn to get around your counter magic. And when you lapse it back to the top of their deck, they're befuddled because they were counting on being able to resolve it that turn, and it just buys you the time you need. So it's good enough to use. Merchant Scroll. Love this card for its flexibility. I'd say number one tutor target for Merchant Scroll is almost certainly the Mana Drain, followed probably by Cyclonic Rift. But because Merchant Scroll fetches Mystical Tutor, it enables a chain that can work your way into some of the more powerful sorceries in the game. So, for example, you can effectively use Merchant Scroll to fetch Rolling Earthquake or Vandal Blast if you need to, by spending a little bit more mana. And this card is an auto-include in basically every deck in EDH. I can't really think of any EDH deck that I wouldn't run Merchant Scroll in. It's just too good and flexible. And along those lines, Muddle the Mixture follows in that category too. This card I have been so impressed by using it over the years. One of the neatest tools in EDH. The ability to transmute into any 2 casting cost artifact is just incredible. The ability to get Winter Orb, probably foremost in terms of raw power that it has, but it gets Mana Rocks, it gets Umezawa's Jitte, it gets Thought Vessel if you have a big hand. It just kind of does everything amazing, and of course it branches out in non-blue-red decks. It allows you to get things like Demonic Tutor and Sylvan Library and Survival of the Fittest, and the list goes on and on and on. There are so many good cards that cost 2 mana, and Muddle fetches all of them, which just makes it one of the best tools and one of the best counter spells in the entire format. Negate, all around excellent flexible counter that I'm quite fond of and use in many decks, and it certainly has a very good place in a devoted control deck like Nin the Pain Artist. Remand, another fantastic tool. Love the ability of Remand to go and counterspell your own spells with when they're on the stack to effectively fizzle your opponent's counter and draw a card for quasi-card advantage. And you can use it to force key things onto the table and control early momentum of the game. Definitely worth using. Snapcaster Mage. This is not only the ability to recycle any of the instants in the deck or the sorceries, but also it's an outlet for shooting with Nin the Pain Artist. So he is an easy include as well. Thought Vessel. I jumped for joy when I saw this card for real, and I couldn't even believe that they would make such a perfect artifact for nearly all the decks that I use, and it's common too, which is awesome. So yeah, no maximum hand size, and it makes mana. This was an easy replacement for the Mind Stone that I had in the deck before that I didn't really like. That no maximum hand size thing is just incredible in pretty much every deck that I use this card in, and it is so good with Necropotence, God. All right, that's all the 2 mana cards in the deck, and if you're paying attention, the total count, I think, up to this point is 67, which means that nearly, well, almost exactly 2/3 of my entire deck costs between 0 and 2 mana. And that's something that it's a sort of maxim that I always teach with deck construction, especially in EDH, where you want power, but you also need speed, and speed is granted from cheap casting costs. So the fact that so much of this deck is either land or things that cost between 0 and 2 mana gives you, it just prevents you from being the guy sitting at the table watching everybody take their turns while you sit there with a bunch of stuff in your hand that costs 3 and 4 and 5 mana, grumbling about the fact that you've only drawn 2 land. Don't be that guy. Play with lots of stuff that's cheap. We're going to move on to the 3s. There's Coalition Relic, which is at its best when it's cast early off of something like a Mana Vault or a Grim Monolith or, of course, the Mishra's Workshop. But the fact that this effectively makes 2 mana over a turn, over half a turn, basically, is amazing. The fact that it taps for mana the turn it comes down is great. It's a great target to clone. It works extremely well with Tezzeret the Seeker. Just all around awesome. And it is a 3 mana fixer that is fetchable with the Trophy Mage, which I've added recently. I think Crucible of Worlds needs no introduction. This card is utterly insane in so many circumstances, just ridiculously powerful with any fetch land, especially one that fetches blue sources. And if you get it in play with the Wasteland or the Strip Mine, you can very quickly just lock your opponent completely out of a game. Just an incredibly good tool. It's anti-land destruction, great flexibility, is a very frequently fetched target off of numerous ways to fetch artifacts, and is one of those cards that your opponent kind of has to deal with quite quickly or they'll just lose to. Dak Faden. Love this guy too. One of the best blue-red cards, period. In fact, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a better blue-red card in all of EDH outside of probably the General. Dak Faden is so cheap, has a really, really strong +1 ability. the ability to just filter your extra lands out of your hand, or just sculpt your hand to do what you need to do. And of course, this -2 ability, if you consider that there's a card called Steel Artifact that they printed way back in Alpha that costs 4 mana to gain control of an artifact, and it's just an enchantment. Dak costs 1 less mana. He's a planeswalker, so he's harder to interact with, and the theft is permanent. Even if they remove Dak Fade and you still control the artifact. The ability to steal a turn 1 or a turn 2 Mana Crypt or Soul Ring or something with Dak Fade is often decisive. You'll just win the game on the spot. And he doesn't really have this, pay no attention to this final ability. I don't think in all the time I've ever played this card, I have ever used that -6. It's just those first 2 abilities, and the fact you get all that for 3 that makes him an auto-include in blue-red. Disallow. This is a brand new tool that was just printed in Aether Revolt. I was very excited when I saw this, and it's effectively a functional reprint of the card Void Slime. I had no problem whatsoever removing Void Shatter from the deck, which I was never really particularly happy with anyway. It's nice to have the exile effect, and the fact that it's colorless is kind of interesting, although you don't generally tend to face Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast very often. But the fact that Void Shatter you couldn't discard Void Shatter to force a will, meant that it just lost some of that flexibility. Disallow solves that problem and has the activated ability of, or the ability to do things like Stone Rending fetch lands at instant speed, which is completely incredible, and in a pinch can stop all sorts of activated abilities like Planeswalker Ultimates, and has just the great flexibility of 3 mana for a hard counter. This card is great. I'm very happy they printed it. There's Disallow's little buddy, Dissipate, which is just better than Void Shatter, I think, because the exile effect can be handy, especially in multiplayer when you're dealing with reanimation effects. And the fact that it's blue makes it actually, I think, better than Void Shatter. So it is definitely one of the 3 mana counters that's worth using. There's Dissolve, which is, I think, one of the best 3 mana counters. It's not number 1, certainly, but the Scry is incredible. I love cards with Scry, and I think that the Scry ability alone makes Dissolve worth using. Fabricate. There's more flexibility from this card. I would say number 1 tutor target with Fabricate, of course, is Mana Crypt, which makes the spell kind of effectively cost only 1 blue mana. You can't really beat that. Pay 1 blue to search your library for a 0 casting cost, 2 mana artifact to put it directly into play. But of course, Fabricate can go get all sorts of other crazy stuff in the mid to late game, like the Shackles and Gilded Lotus and Phyrexian Metamorph, and it's just all around awesome tutor. Forbid. There it is. Number 1 3 mana counter in EDH. This card is tremendously strong, and especially in the Pain Artist, the buyback ability becomes trivial once you have the general running, and allows you sometimes, as I mentioned before, especially when you have an unlimited hand size, courtesy of the Thought Vessel or the Reliquary Tower, to completely contain and own multiple players at once, especially when they're not playing with counterspells. And it's amazing watching how demoralized people get when they play against Forbid. This card just earns so many scoops, even scoops when people are not, when they really actually have a viable chance, because you just feel so hopeless facing a Forbid and a bunch of mana, because you know that you have to just fight through 2 to 3 hard counters in your opponent's hand that there's no way to get around of. And it really, really punishes spells that cost a lot of mana because of the reliability. But that said, don't be afraid to cast Forbid as a hard counter. You have without buyback, because you have tons and tons of redundant counter spells, and it isn't important necessarily to buy it back. I've certainly watched people play games with Forbid where they've just either been reluctant to cast it because they couldn't afford to buy it back, or they didn't have the fuel to buy it back, or I've watched people just be reckless and throw away stuff that they really needed in order to keep Forbid around. So don't be afraid to use it if you need to without the buyback, but be looking for opportunities to tutor up this card once you've got Nin running or one of the other card advantage engines, and you just win the game on the spot. It is fantastic. Stoic Rebuttal. Another 3 mana counter, and I certainly have a lot of them in the deck because there just aren't that many great 2 mana counters. And the Metalcraft ability on this card, I would say, comes into play a sizable portion of the time, probably at least half the time that it's cast. And I mean, at its very worst, it's a 3 mana, it's cancel effectively. But when you do get Metalcraft off of it, it is Counterspell, and everyone knows how incredible Counterspell is. And I think the ability to do that with Stoic Rebuttal more than makes it worth using. Thirst for Knowledge. This is a card I think that is at the bottom rung of cards that I am currently including in the deck. It's definitely a card that you could probably find a justification to remove if you really wanted to. That said, I like instant speed card drawing. There's a ton of artifacts in the deck, and you can very often frequently afford to throw one away. But if you're looking for a card to remove in order to make room for a card that you're really fond of or you're sideboarding for multiplayer, I think Thirst for Knowledge is a pretty painless thing to take out. Not so much for Trinket Mage. This guy is phenomenal, one of the most powerful creatures in all of EDH, and again, a complete auto-include in any deck in the format that runs blue, in my opinion, because it gets Soul Ring and Mana Crypt. So a 3-mana card that gives you a 2/2 body, as well as fetching the 2 most powerful cards in the entire format. No-brainer. Plus, he gets Sensei's Divining Top sometimes. He gets Mox Opal or Mox Diamond a lot of the time, and can even tutor up Strip Mine using the Expedition map. And that flexibility is way, way, way too good to pass up. He's excellent. And there's his big sister, the Trophy Mage, just printed in Aether Revolt. This is another card I just added. And I've had mixed results with it so far. What I am finding actually is that tutoring for a 3-mana thing doesn't feel very good. In a way, I mean, it's weird because I fabricate for 3-mana artifacts all the time. But most of the time I am fabricating for 0 and 1-mana artifacts. And casting a Trophy Mage to go get a 3 that you can't necessarily play that turn and can't play for a couple more turns isn't quite as feel-good as I thought it would be. I still think that the card belongs in the deck, but I'm a little less bullish on it than I was before. That said, I think it probably does belong. And I think in multiplayer where you have more mana available and the game develops slower, it does make a lot more sense. And it does fetch the most probably powerful pure tool in the entire deck, especially for dealing with multiple opponents, and that's the Veldican Shackles. And it also gets Crucible of Worlds, it gets the Coalition Relic, and those facts alone, I think, probably still merit its inclusion, but not 100% on her yet. I do like her, though. My buddy, the Shackles. This card is so powerful. If any card is very definitive of what makes Nin work, and especially in a multiplayer environment, it's Veldican Shackles. This is a card that, if it's either destroyed or you're forced to discard it or your opponent exiles it or it goes to the graveyard and you don't have a way to retrieve it, it's one of those tools that really affects how the game plays out from that point onward. Not having access to Shackles is completely changes how you have to deal with the board state. And when you get a Shackles in play and are able to copy it, you very quickly reach a point in the game where your opponents can't do anything. And not only is just the ability to steal creatures incredibly strong, but if you have Nin the Pain Artist active and Veldican Shackles is in play, you have one of the most powerful engines that exists in all of EDH, which is the ability to steal any creature indiscriminately and shoot it to draw cards off of it while killing it. And the card advantage that grants is so overwhelming that very, very quickly